to Bad Ideas, the show where we look at misfires, mistakes, and miscalculations from all throughout history.
I'm Tony Southcott.
And I'm Albert Berg, and today's episode is brought to you by our featured patron this week, Doc Occupant.
What up, Doc Ock? Thank you very much.
Tony's got our bad idea for the week. Tony, what are we talking about today?
We're going to be talking about basically killing the messenger, the Khwarezmian Shah, and Genghis Khan. Actually,
Okay.
there's a lot of debate on how to actually pronounce it. It could be Chinggis, it could be Genghis, it could be Genghis.
We're going to stick with Genghis.
Yeah.
I'm fine with that. We can be
Yeah.
wrong consistently.
Yeah, and I mean, it's not even really his name. His name is Temujin. But for the purposes of this, we're going to call him Genghis Khan. In the early 1210s, Asia was being besieged by a growing Mongol empire led by Genghis Khan himself. The Great Khan, his sons, and his generals would spread far and wide as they conquered huge swaths of China and beyond. While their exploits would take them all the way to Western Europe before it was over, we're talking about a very particular region that made a huge mistake. It was a mistake that might be the biggest reinforcement of don't kill the messenger in human history. The Khwarezmian Empire was broad at this point. It stretched from Turkey to the borders of India, covering modern-day Iran, most of Afghanistan, and many other countries. Under the rule of Allah ad-Din Muhammad II, the empire saw wars, expansion, and some very large ego-driven mistakes. Muhammad II seemed to crave legitimacy, but this isn't part of the bad idea we're going to talk about today, but it's definitely a mistake. After conquering his decent-sized portion of the world, Muhammad asked the Caliphate in Baghdad to officially give him the title of Shah. A Shah is a title usually reserved for Persian kings, lords, and conquerors. The Caliphate, which is sort of a unified ruler under Islam, think like the Pope, but for Islam, denied him the title. From what I read, this was basically because Muhammad II failed to offer the usual bribes, homage, and other pretenses that the Caliph demanded. At this, Muhammad II marched on Baghdad, only to have his army caught in the mountains during a blizzard. Thousands of his warriors would die because of the winter weather, and he had to go home empty-handed. This was in 1217, just a few years before he would face the Mongols.
So, just to reiterate, going into war during the winter in ancient times was not the bad idea here.
No, not like there's so many instances where we could have a bad idea there, and I'm sure someday we're going to cover those. But yeah, don't try to drag an entire army through the mountains in winter in the 1200s. It's just not a good idea.
Yeah, basically anywhere. I don't even know if it's a good idea now. People still got to stay warm.
Yeah, and there were a lot of issues with like the Germans in World War II where they didn't have enough coats and they didn't know how to handle the cold and things like that. It was more logistics issues. I'm sure that you could do it better today. But still, like, a few North Face jackets isn't going to face or change the fact that it's really, really cold. At this point, Genghis Khan had conquered 2/3 of China. He was beginning to dismount from his campaigns and look deeper into the governance of his realm. He wanted to increase trade with the surrounding nations, so he began to bring the Silk Road under singular control.
And the Silk Road is the trade route between Asia and the West, correct?
Yes.
So until they figured out how to sail ships around the Horn of Africa, which was a real tough nut to crack, they went overland, and the Silk Road would have been sort of any trading route that you would have between China and European-ish areas.
Yeah, it wasn't exactly like trademarked, this is the Silk Road. It was a lot of trade routes that were through there. It wasn't as well-defined as, say, some of the Roman roads that were actually like cobblestone and sort of paved. But it was a series of roads that led from the east to the west.
And it was incredibly valuable because China had some stuff that the Europeans couldn't make and they really, really wanted to get. Like silk and spices. That's literally called the Silk Road, obviously.
And like it was oftentimes kind of a mess because it went through so many different countries that it was hard to encourage trade. You had to, like, a lot of places wanted tariffs on things as people walked through, and so on and so forth. So one of the Mongols' goals was to get control of the Silk Road so that they could have control over this trade route. This single representative would bring hundreds of Islamic merchants bearing goods from the Mongol Empire, from China, and from a lot of other places as sort of a peace offering between the two nations, trying to encourage trade. Unfortunately, Muhammad II had heard of the Mongol conquest as one of his ambassadors was in China when this happened. He actually saw the sacking of a city that would eventually turn into Beijing, where it was just absolute slaughter. The brutality and the near genocidal way that the Khan operated did not give Muhammad much confidence in this particular trade offering. He believed that these were spies, they were just trying to spread propaganda, and that Genghis had set his eyes on the Khwarezmian Empire. A governor under his power had every one of these merchants and the emissary arrested.
So Genghis is trying to calm down. He's like, no, we killed a bunch of dudes, but there is a time now to reap the benefits of all those dudes we killed. One of those benefits might be that we can make a lot of money off of this cool Silk Road that people are apparently crazy about, getting silk and other stuff from us. And he wants to make an alliance with Khwarezmian, is his name?
The Khwarezmians was the name of the empire, and Muhammad II was the Shah of these people.
So he's sending out emissaries to Muhammad II, and Muhammad II sees these guys, knows Genghis by reputation as just an animal, and his response is, "Nah, we're not doing this." Am I understanding this correctly? Like, he can't see Genghis as a rational actor. He thinks because of his brutality, he must be up to something brutal again.
Yeah, and this was mostly because of what his ambassadors had told him about what happened in China. Because the Khan had actually a lot of times taken in smaller states sort of to work as vassals for him. And if they were willing to basically give him all the wealth, he would not murder their entire city. And he did this for a lot of city-states, and people kind of started to fall in line before facing the idea of taking on the Mongols head-on. So he was kind of pulling this down, and Genghis Khan actually said that the conquering is always the easy part. It's the governance that's the hard part, and this is him trying to get into that role.
It's an interesting problem for Genghis Khan, I got to admit.
Yeah, especially because the efficiency of his brutality is legendary, and we're going to get into some statistics later, but it's something else. Also, this distrust was made worse when Muhammad II found out that the Caliph al-Nasir had tried to instigate a war between the Khwarezmians and the Mongols. This ended up being sort of a short skirmish in which Muhammad II ended up having to fight about 20,000 Mongol forces, and he thought that he was going to crush them under the force of an army of 100,000, but over the course of, I think it was over a week, he took massive casualties just trying to take out this small force of Mongols.
The Mongols were not messing around.
No, they had some of the most brutal and best military tactics of their era, and by a long shot.
Yeah, I want to take a rabbit trail on the Mongols so bad, and I know that's not the point of this, Tony.
I mean, if you want to talk about it a little bit, we're going to get into some of the stuff later.
Well, one of the things I have heard recently talked about, and it was something that I kind of knew, is the fact that the Mongols basically didn't require a supply train in the same way that other militaries did. So you may have thought you had more people than the Mongols, but if you're counting people in your military, you're probably counting people who can cook for your soldiers and people who are messengers and people who are, supplying things. And the Mongols were essentially a traveling self-supply organism. They could drink their horse's blood to survive and then keep going. They didn't need, and this may be some exaggeration, but they didn't need as much in the way of supplies and a train of people behind them to help them get along. They were trained well enough to be able to live off the land it was subsistence
type stuff going on whenever they were just harder beyond hard. They crossed over deserts that nobody thought they could get through. They did things that no other army was capable of because of how hard these guys were and how self-sustaining they were. Like you said, they would drink the blood of their horses. And then whenever, once the lean times were over and they sacked a city, they would just feast on everything that the city would give them.
So you really got to calculate with these guys. They are not an easy target to take down.
No, not at all. Not to mention they have some really incredible autonomous leadership. Whenever these battles start, it's 7 different columns of independent Mongol hordes going after the Khwarezmians. But that's all stuff that I'm going to get to in just a
sexy
little bit.
Decentralized command, Tony. I love it.
Yeah, getting Jocko Willink up in here.
He did not invent that.
No, but he admires it greatly.
He's a proponent.
Yes. In some ways, I understand the paranoia that Muhammad II had. We talked about earlier how the Khan wanted these vassal states and these people that were loyal to him. And most historians believe that this is exactly what Genghis Khan wanted from Khwarezmia. Rarely did Genghis let a slight like imprisoning his messenger go, but he actually chose to give a second chance to the Shah and his people. He sent out another group of ambassadors. He sent these 3 ambassadors, and the Shah and his governor decided to behead them. And the people that they were with, he decided to cut their beards off. He sent them back to the Khan, shaven and with the heads of his ambassadors.
This is a big deal, by the way. This happens in the Bible sometimes, too, where they'll cut the beards off, and it's not a haircut. We aren't in that mindset anymore, but it was the biggest diss you could give somebody. The other thing that, in the Bible story that I know that they did this, they cut off the guy's robes so they didn't cover their buttocks. So they're walking with their butts showing, which maybe gives you a little more flavor of what this would have been like to have your beard cut off, but
yeah, it's humiliation and it's sending a message.
Yeah.
And the Khan believed that ambassadors were sacred and inviolable. You don't kill them because they are bringing the will of leaders to the forefront. This is how you get business done, and these men are bringing, in a lot of sense, like the idea of the divine word. And any idea of peace vanished when their heads hit the ground. This is a man who earned the title, the Flail of God, and he would now descend upon the Khwarezmians.
And I gotta say, I can definitely see Genghis's point here. Like, Genghis sent these guys to carry his words. Killing them is like batting at the air that carried the sound waves that insulted you. They aren't the people. They are just literally vassals of the message of Genghis Khan. For them to be killed is a huge... It's not even like the guy said, nah, I don't want to make a treaty with you. He's broken some kind of rule here. And I, especially if Genghis already thought this way, I could definitely see why you would take this as a major insult.
Yeah, especially whenever you're kind of going off of your basic character line and trying to be peaceful, and they basically instigate a war with you. And there were a lot of people who called Muhammad II like the next Alexander because he did have his empire and he had done some very good things. So a little bit of this was ego-driven. And man, he is just picking the wrong fight. Like, it's... Yeah. This is a man who
heard
said
this
that...
in the Pyrrhic War one, too. Like, if you're in the shadow of Alexander, people are like, you're just like that Alexander guy. You're like, I could take on anybody. And you end up taking on the wrong guy.
Yeah. And this is a man who said that those who oppose him will be like a stone thrown into water. They will simply disappear. And over again, these words that would just sound like hype. Genghis Khan made it more than true. They killed the messenger of a man who a lot of historians think was directly responsible for murdering up to 11% of the world's entire population.
Take that, atomic bomb.
Yeah. These estimates are done with a man who only had arrows, axes, and sheer will. And they killed up to 40 million people.
Which is not a good thing, by the way.
No, we're not saying it's a good thing.
On the one hand, it's impressive, but, like, this is worse than Hitler levels of genocide.
Like 55 million people died in World War II, so he's pretty much on that level. He killed more people.
But by percentage,
by percentage,
higher.
It's way bigger. And we're talking about, like, I think Stalin killed 20 million of his own people, so he's double Stalin. The only person that might have a higher kill count is Mao Zedong. That's how big that's how much Genghis Khan affected the planet. There is a measurable amount in the drop of CO2 levels in ice core samples after Genghis Khan. That's the type of force we're talking about here, and this is the man you choose to pick a fight with. Granted, this is sort of what made Khan, like, he was big enough after the conquest in China, but this is when people started folding underneath him. For the Khwarezmians, this is also horrible timing. Formerly, the Mongols were scattered tribes that had trouble with infighting and siege warfare. After the invasion of China, Genghis Khan took their greatest mind for siege engines and heavy weapons and added them to his own. He ran his armies under a massive meritocracy, which often included incorporating generals he admired from armies that had fought against him. Somehow the Khwarezmians thought that this was their time to make the stand, even though he had conscripted thousands of engineers for siege weaponry. After moderate amounts of smack talk back and forth, the Mongols descended on the Khwarezmians like a tidal wave. They attacked and sieged cities from all sides. They didn't fight like old medieval armies. They worked like a modern military force, coming from multiple angles and fronts, swarming deep into the Shah's empire. Independent leadership of the highest caliber ripping into all corners of this area and basically doing whatever they wanted. Whenever they did encounter decent-sized armies, a lot of times they were able to use standard Mongolian tactics such as feigned retreats and so on to disperse and encircle the enemy. It was just basically they were outmaneuvered and completely unable to keep up with what was going on here.
And just to drill it down on the feigned retreats thing, that was a tactic the Mongols had, which, for all I know, might be useful to people today, where they would set up like they were going to have a big fight. They would go do sort of the standard, everybody charges together and fights, and then the Mongols would be like, "Oh no, we're in trouble, let's back off." But they weren't really. They were knowing exactly what they were doing, but they would make the other army think, "Oh, we've got them now." The problem is, when you start running to chase after the Mongols, you break your formation, you're no longer as organized and as strong as you used to be, and the Mongols all of a sudden turn around and they ain't running anymore, and you're like, wait, we're not, okay, and then you're dead. That's what happens with the feigned retreat.
It's not even just like after a few minutes, it's that they would have the cavalry chase them for, say, a day, 20, 30 miles, so that they could get to where they stored their fresh horses as well as a fresh supply of men for the Mongols. So you have an entire force that's broken up, not in formation, that is dead tired, going up against a fresh army that fought you like a swarm of bees from all sides and basically slaughtered you.
If I ever get to use that tactic, I will do it. It's a good tactic.
Yeah, it's a very good tactic.
It's a good way to kill a lot of people, Tony. That's something we're apparently about on this episode of the podcast.
And I'm sorry if I sound excited. I really enjoy Mongol military history for what, like, the tactics and the incredible forethought that was put into it. But these are massive, insane atrocities. And it's easier to talk about because it's 800 years old.
Yeah. Well, and to be fair, the other guys would have done the same thing to them if they could have. There's not really a good guy side on this, as far as I can tell. So you might as well be impressed by the guy who's executing his plan the best.
Yeah. And I was reading about some of the interesting things that happened in these battles where, like, the Mongols were outnumbered in one of the battles, so they put a bunch of straw men on their horses to make it look like they were... they had more, because every Mongol went to war with 2 or 3 horses, so they could always have a fresh horse. It's why sometimes they were able to cover like 80 miles in a day. And so like they tried to bolster their numbers. A lot of times people thought that there were a lot more Mongols than there actually were because they were attacking from so many sides, and because they were using weird tactics like putting a straw guy on a horse where without binoculars or something you'd think it's a guy. The Shah's tactic here was basically to keep garrisons with about 40,000 soldiers in many of these cities. And this isn't the worst idea before the Mongols actually had their siege engines, but they also were able to just chill. The first city took 5 months before someone actually just kind of defected and opened the doors, and things went crazy there. And whenever they got into these sieges, they offered a choice of, you can either bring your citizens out and we'll sack the city, or everyone can die. And sometimes whenever they did this, it wasn't exactly holding up to that deal, because a lot of times they would divide up the entire city and then murder the entire city, like just one by one by one. They would figure out how many people the soldiers needed to have or needed to kill per person, and each one would be responsible for killing 10 people, 15 people, 100 people, things like that. And it was just, they weren't always the best about that. But in this,
they weren't honest about if you throw down your arms and come out, we'll spare you. They would sometimes just murder you anyway.
Yeah, and that usually depended on what happened during the sieges of the city. Like, you've got one where the Khan's favored son-in-law gets killed, and as kind of a gift to his daughter, the place is called Nishapur, something like that. And because they killed him, and his daughter had full autonomy to do what she wanted, She had the entire city killed and had all of their heads put into pyramids outside of it. And they're saying that that could have been well over 200,000 heads in pyramids.
Nice girl.
Yeah. But also, whenever some of these cities were surrendered, to keep Mongol casualties low, they would have the people that surrendered, sometimes hundreds of thousands, go and fill in the moats and be the ones that were trying to siege the city and fighting their own garrisoned soldiers. So these soldiers would end up fighting their own people who were untrained, so it would be kind of a massacre on massacre going on, where they were having to fight their own people. And it was a lot of just psychological warfare that would wear these people down and break their morale. In this first city, we got kind of ahead of ourselves there. Whenever they found the governor that had ordered the arrest of the original ambassadors, there's a few different histories, but most of them say that instead of being beheaded, they went full Game of Thrones with it and poured silver into his eyes and ears to show that his greed had cost them so much. After another city fell, this one called Bukhara, we get to what was one of the few actual recorded quotes of Genghis Khan. There weren't a lot, we don't know exactly what he looks like. There wasn't, an autobiography like Marcus Aurelius or anything that was written by the Khan. So there aren't a lot of actual quotes, but this was taken down by some of the Islamic scholars in this town. And he said, "O people, know that you have committed great sins, and that the great ones among you have committed these sins. If you ask me what proof I have for these words, I say it is because I am the punishment of God. If you had not committed great sins, God would not have sent a punishment like me upon you." So you kind of get into the mindset of Genghis Khan and just how he believed it was both divinely inspired and also that there was nothing that could stop him. And shortly after this was said, Bukhara was turned entirely to ash. A full list of cities would fall in much the same way. After all of this, the Shah started to flee. With 30,000 men pursuing the Shah, they chased him from his lands. And as the Shah was trying to get away, he was encouraging his people to burn their crops, to kill their livestock, and basically not to give anything to the Mongols. It was one of the early instances of the scorched earth policy, simply to deny the Mongols the loot and their means to campaign further. This caused sort of a lot of odd civil wars inside of these communities where half the people wanted to surrender to the Mongols and half wanted to resist. In one of these cities, the people that wanted to surrender actually killed off the resistance for the other thing, thinking that this would please the Mongols. And this actually ended up being their undoing because Subadai Khan, one of the sons of the Khan, decided that he couldn't trust people that would kill their own people, so he killed all the men in that entire city.
I don't know. That seems like a no-win situation you're putting these guys in. They're like, look, we're gonna surrender. We killed all the people who don't want to surrender. Oh yeah? You seem kind of shifty. I'm gonna kill you anyway.
Yeah, and who knows? I think a little of this was Subadai being frustrated by the fact that the Shah kept getting away. There were numerous instances where they almost caught up to the Shah, and there were even times where they wounded him, but he kept getting away. And in the end, the Shah actually managed to get onto a ship and escape to a Caspian island. But he was so worn down and so distraught by everything that happened, he died very shortly after getting away. His son would be the final of the Khwarezmians, and he rallied an army of about 60,000 men from Afghanistan and a lot of Turks, and they were absolutely crushed and pushed into the Indus River. So this was the end of the Khwarezmian Empire. If it wasn't for this one messenger or these messengers being killed, there might actually be a country of the Khwarezmians today. It's just insane to think about how this one major mistake ended up leading to wiping out an entire empire. An empire that stretched over some of the hardest and most unconquerable terrain on the planet.
And this is really the end of the golden age of the Arab world, right? This is where sort of the end of, we use Arabic numbers today because there was some really smart people and a lot of smart people grouped together in some of these Arabic cities. And if my understanding is correct, and I might be wrong, this is from memory and I'm not a historian, but this conquest of the Mongols actually destroyed a lot of existing knowledge and sort of took apart not only just people, but also institutions and structures that wouldn't really be rebuilt until later in Europe.
Yeah, and that's exactly what it was. You were looking at it was basically a renaissance there, and intelligent with math, with science, with all this stuff, and they got forced back into medieval times. And part of this was because the Caliphate believed that he had absolute divine rule, and Genghis Khan would not accept that. He would accept others being rulers of areas, but he would not accept that there was one person that was like full divine providence and able to say that they were the one in charge of everything. And so whenever he sacked Baghdad, he basically also tried to eliminate their history. He threw all of their books into the rivers. It was said that the rivers ran black with ink and red with blood because of how much they actually destroyed. Like, who knows what human technology would be at this moment if the Mongols hadn't done that, or if possibly the center of intelligence and everything in the world might actually still be in the Middle East instead of kind of shifting over to Europe in the following centuries.
Right. We could see it's not just that this guy destroyed his own empire and his own legacy. He might literally have altered the course of history for the worse for his people. Again, not just by getting them killed, but by destroying the legacy that they could have had and the things that they could have built down in the future, just because he couldn't trust Genghis Khan.
Yeah. Like, it just was sort of a domino effect that left the Middle East wide open for more conquer. And if he would have just accepted a trade deal, this isn't saying that Khan wouldn't have changed his mind later. He might have done this anyway, eventually. But to not try to go for the peaceful option first against another powerful empire is just so ego-driven and wrong. Like, it doesn't make any sense. And so Muhammad II is widely reviled in a lot of different historical contexts, including the Islamic texts that were written about this time.
It doesn't seem like it was a good decision.
No.
And it's easier to look back on it, right? It's hard to be in the moment and not know the future and have to make these kinds of calls. It's real tough to be that kind of leader, but definitely with the benefit of hindsight, you can tell that this was not the right call.
Yeah, definitely. And as history has shown many times over, it is just a bad idea to kill the messenger.
And to go up against Genghis Khan also.
Yeah. There's not many people that live to talk about that. His sons had some later conquests that didn't quite work out, like Ogadai and Kublai, and several others, like whenever they tried to take over Japan and things like that. They weren't really good with oceans and ships. They were much better on land masses. But it's something where like the Khan ended up with the largest land empire in human history. So it's like there was just a lot that fell. Like, they got into Poland, they got that far before they ended up having to retreat because of the Khan dying. So it's staggering how far this all went. Also, like, if you guys want to end up hearing like basically an 8-hour thing that details just how far this goes, Dan Carlin has an excellent podcast series called The Wrath of the Khans. There's a lot of good books on this. It's fascinating reads, and we were just focusing on the Khwarezmians and this particular bad idea, but it is definitely worth a listen to read up more on the Mongols.
And speaking of Dan Carlin, just to put in another plug for him, we're like not sponsored or affiliated anyway, but the Wrath of the Khans is now behind a paywall. And if you're thinking, I don't know if I want to pay for a podcast, it's literally hours and hours and hours of super high quality, well-researched stuff. It's basically an audiobook about this era of history, and it's definitely worth $10.
Yeah, delivered by one of the coolest guys that would be like the history teacher you wish you had.
Yeah. In other words, go listen to that better podcast and pay them money.
I mean, you get this weekly. He does his like once every 4 months. So it's like there's a little more research and all that involved. But thank you guys for listening to this. Thank you for being part of Bad Ideas. If you enjoy this, check out our Patreon at patreon.com/humanechoes. $2, $5, $10 a month. You can get a lot of extra bonus content, pins, all sorts of awesome things.
Thank you guys so much for listening. We'll see you guys next week with another bad idea.
Bye.
Bye.